the death row case of Carlton Gary. I asked David to go back to the 70s and lay out the story.
Well, the Stocking Stranglings was a serial killing spree in the late 1970s in 8 months in Columbus, Georgia, a very conservative city in the Deep South, about 100 miles south of Atlanta. 7 elderly, mainly rich white women who lived alone were brutally raped and strangled, mostly with their own stockings, by a serial killer whom the police seemed completely unable to apprehend. He seemed to be able to rampage through an upscale white neighborhood known as Winton with complete impunity. And for many years, the police had no really viable suspects until finally in 1984, they arrested a guy called Carlton Gary, who was no poster boy. He, by his own admission, had a criminal record of some length, but he'd always maintained he'd never committed any violent crimes. And in 1986, he was convicted and sentenced to death, and he's on death row now, 21 years later.
How was he picked up?
Well, that is a very interesting and complicated process, but the cop who probably can claim to have solved the crime more than anybody else, a man called Detective Michael Sellers, looked me in the eye in a hotel in Gwinnett County, north of Atlanta, and said that his investigation began with a phone call from God. The simple answer is there is no clear reason why they picked on him as a suspect, other than the fact that he had been involved in a crime in Albany, New York, in upstate New York in 1970, where an elderly woman was raped and strangled, although he had always maintained that he had not committed this crime, that he'd only acted as the lookout. Indeed, he wasn't charged with this murder, another guy was. When it came to his trial in Columbus, Georgia, the district attorney there, Bill Smith, said that in fact he had committed this murder, although he couldn't produce any evidence that this was in fact the case. I've since found evidence to show that it's quite clear that he didn't, in the form of footprints that the killer left in the murdered woman's apartment, and forensic tests that were done on those footprints by the scientists in New York in 1970, and what they showed is that the killer there had size 9.5 shoes, whereas Carlton Gary has size 13.5 or 14 shoes. He has unusually large feet. So there's good reason to suppose that he didn't do that murder, but belief that he had was really why Columbus Police Department made him a suspect. And then there was, as I say, this mysterious phone call from God to the detective, which put him on the scent.
Talk more about how they picked Carlton Gary up, what role he played in the community, and then talk about the community and the response and how the investigation went on for 8 years.
Well, Carlton Gary was born in Columbus, and he lived there till he was 13 years old, and then his mother moved to Florida, and so he left the city. He had a pretty itinerant lifestyle in his late teens. He was a musician for a time. He was working in a variety of jobs in upstate New York and other places in the sort of northeast. And he also was committing crimes. He was, as I say, convicted of this robbery as being an accomplice of the killer in Albany, and he went to prison for about 5 years for that. But he made his way back to Columbus, Georgia in the early fall of 1977, and just before, or maybe just after, the Stocking Strangling murders began. Now, he continued to live in Columbus for about a year after they finished. There's a myth that's very widespread down there which says, oh, well, the murders began when he moved back to Columbus and they stopped when he left. In fact, that's not true. He was living in Columbus for longer after the murders ended than the entire period of the murders. But in 1979, in the spring of 1979, he was arrested in South Carolina trying to rob a fast food restaurant in a rather inept fashion. He held a gun to the cashier, and she said, "I don't believe that gun's loaded," which indeed it wasn't. And he ran out the back into a swamp and was arrested in rather deep water by the police, and I think he was worried that an alligator might be about to eat him. So, you know, he looked like a plausible suspect. I think what probably happened is that the South Carolina authorities, when he left prison in 1984, before his arrest, told the Columbus Police Department that he might be headed their way, as indeed he was. And I think what probably happened is that this detective thought, look at his record, maybe he's a Stocking Strangler murder. But what is very much the case, of course, is that these murders were the most enormous blow to the community of Columbus. They were happening in an all-white upscale neighborhood, and the police seemed completely unable to do anything to prevent them from happening. And there was really a reign of terror for the period of those killings. The area was swamped with cops, with state troopers, with soldiers from Fort Benning, the nearby military base. And as I say, nothing seemed to be able to stop this guy from killing. I think there's a real possibility that the killer was actually white, because this is an all-white neighborhood. I think any African-American insinuating himself into that neighborhood at night and trying to break into women's homes would have been easily apprehended, whereas they weren't looking for a white person. Incidentally, the reason they believed that the killer was black was because the local coroner, who actually had no training as a mortician, sorry, he had training as a mortician, but not as a doctor or as a pathologist or any kind of forensic scientist, but he told the cops that pubic hairs found at the crime scenes displayed what he called negroid characteristics, by which he meant they were black and curly, and perhaps he had never seen a white person with black and curly pubic hair. But in any event, the police were convinced that the killer was black, and of course, in the Deep South, especially in the 1970s, I mean, this added an enormous charge. The fact that an African-American was violating vulnerable elderly white women, the racial dimension to that gave these crimes an even greater impact.